Okay, so with the second video, we're going to look at studying social interactions via the symbolic interactionist theory here, because really it's this theory that gives us the most of what we know about interactions, how they work, their outcomes, and that sort of thing. So let's get into that. So where the statuses and roles that we learned about last video are really important because they guide our behavior. Each person still has a considerable ability to shape what happens moment to moment. Reality is not as fixed as we think it is. The phrase, the social construction of reality, identifies the process by which people creatively shape reality through the social interactions that happen. But how exactly do we define reality for ourselves? Answering this question is the objective of ethnomethodology, which is a specialized approach to symbolic interactionism. Ethnomethodology is the study of the way people make sense of their lives. Ethnomethodology assumes that there are countless unspoken, often unconscious rules used to maintain order and predictability in everyday social interactions. Because so much of this process is ingrained, the only effective way to expose how we make sense of events is to purposely break the rules. And deliberately ignoring conventional rules and observing then how people how people respond allows us to tease out how people negotiate or create reality in that sense and through their interactions. Now, ethnomethodology essentially is, trying to uncover what are the people rules in our society? What are the rules that guide our behavior? Now, remember the opening question that I had you, the opening news story and the question that I had you considering here. And specifically, it's this question here: how do you interact with, homeless individuals if you encounter them? And the answer, so I'll just say that where you've brought yourself to those interactions, there are likely a lot of rules or some rules that you've learned from others that have, given you that framework for how, once you sort of determine by virtue of, the status of a person that you've assumed therefore to be homeless, how you then should act and react and interact with them. And so thinking of this question here, how do you interact with a homeless person you encounter? What might be some of the rules you might follow in that situation when interacting or seeing a homeless person? Now, there are countless rules that we rely upon to maintain order and predictability in our everyday lives. And while the rules are unspoken and often unconscious, they are nonetheless extremely powerful. When a rule is broken, it can lead to a failed interaction. So think of a situation, an interaction you've had with someone where you were left feeling uncomfortable or awkward or frustrated. And that's because maybe they didn't follow the rules and follow what was expected of them. And then therefore you don't know what's going on in that situation. Or maybe you didn't follow the rules specifically. And then that then led to a very uncomfortable interaction because they also now don't know what's going on because the rules hadn't been followed. And so what people do is they either kind of just opt out of the interaction and walk away, for example, because they don't know now. I don't know what rules apply, so I'm just going to leave. Or they try to construct a new version of reality or new definition of the situation to try and accommodate for the unexpected behavior. And in this way, defining a situation is a collective process. It's a negotiated process between you and the other person. And all of the important clues are going to come from that other person and from the surroundings involved in that interaction. And for that, we use the dramaturgical analysis work of Irving Goffman to help really illustrate and understand how interactions follow, or how they how they happen is not the right word, but that's what we'll go with. So Irving Goffman, a fun fact, Irving Goffman actually was born in Canada. His family was Canadian, but then at a young age he moved to the US. So technically he's an American sociologist. But I always like to tell people that fun fact. So Irving Goffman enhanced our understanding of everyday life and in this process of defining the situation by noting that people interacting behave much like actors on a stage. Goffman compared social life to a series of performances given by actors on a stage in front of an audience. Our status determines our part in the play, and the role attached to that status will serve as the script, supplying our dialogue and our actions. Just like the theater, the acting, there's the setting is important, including the physical props and the scenery. Those also have to be present if a social actor is to give the credible performance, or to know what performance is required of them given the particular setting or stage or scene that they find themselves in. Goffman also talked about front stage and backstage behavior. The front stage is a part of the social performance that is used to define the situation in a general way for the audience. It's what the audience sees. It's front stage there. It's that role performance component of our behavior. The backstage, on the other hand, is what is it's pertinent and important to the performance, but it's not allowed on front stage, or it doesn't take place on front stage, so no one sees the backstage. So just like an actor, who performs, the actual performance is on the front stage. Maybe them getting ready in their dressing room is the backstage behavior. So they're preparing, they're getting ready, but no one is watching them. So for example, you as a student, performing your role as a student, your front stage would be the classroom, and whenever you're in the physical school building is your front stage. But backstage might be when you're at home or at the library studying or doing homework or just reading material for your class the next day. That's your backstage performance. Now, key in all of this, and key to determining kind of that definition of the situation and how actual interactions unfold, is this concept of impression management. The audience is always judging our performance, so we attempt to perform our role as well as possible to control the impressions that we give to others. So this is what impression management is. So similarly, as an actor, every actor wants to perform their role brilliantly and have everyone cheer, or they want to win awards for their role. We do the same in all of our role performances every day. We know that audience is judging us and expecting us to act a certain way, so we have to make sure that we're always managing that performance in a way that is beneficial to us. I'm going to give you a couple of examples here of impression management and a couple of other things here. And I'm going to use the work of two researchers, actually a husband and wife team of researchers, Albus and Albus. I've forgotten their first names, so my apologies to them. But Albus and Albus, a couple, a decade, 10 or more years ago, they did a lot of research on university students, college students, and specifically using symbolic interactionism and specifically using dramaturgical analysis to try and really get a good description of interactions that take place within an educational setting between students and teachers there. So one of their studies was looking at impression management. They studied how students perform their role as a student in a way that will generate a positive response or a positive impression from their audience, which they were specifically defining as the teacher in the setting, and because they were looking specifically at the setting of writing a test, so writing an examination, and so the teacher's the audience, the student is the test taking role that they're performing there. So in that setting, Albus and Albus said that students writing exams are at a high risk of stigmatization. So there's a high risk that a student could be accused of cheating, and that's a bad thing, and there's punishments that come from that. So therefore, because of the high risk of stigmatization, students have to try and avoid such a stigma and such a master status in this setting here. So after observing and interviewing students, Albus and Albus discovered that students may take steps to try and ensure that they will not be falsely accused of cheating. So this is a way that they tried to manage the impression to make sure what the teacher saw, what the audience saw, was a student that was not cheating. So they identified that students either took some actions and did some certain behaviors, or they avoided doing certain behaviors as part of their role performance. So actions taken were things like minute overconformity with the rules. So students, for example, would be really careful to hand in papers before gathering, or hand in the paper or the test before they gathered up the rest of their possessions to leave, because they didn't want to, give that impression that they were, they had cheat sheet notes and that sort of thing. Minute overconformity with the rules also covered things like if they had to blow their nose, they would wave the tissue around first, just so that it was clear that there was nothing written on the tissue. Other actions taken: expression of repression of creature releases. So these are those aspects of the self that steal through the facade of social control. So if a student needed to use the bathroom, they would make exaggerated gestures to impress upon the urgency of the situation. So if you kind of want to know what that is, just think about if you had to go to the bathroom, what would be an exaggerated gesture that you would make to make it clear that you really had to go to the bathroom. Shows of innocence, lack of activity, students felt might be read as a lack of preparation. So even though they weren't writing, but they would, and not writing answers because they still were thinking about what to write. Even if they weren't writing answers, they would underline things or circle things or even just doodle so it looked like they were still actively working, as opposed to just sitting there and potentially not prepared, therefore more likely to cheat in that particular way. So I'll just take a note before we go into actions avoided. As an instructor, I haven't had tests in my classes for years. I moved away from tests, but I always found it really fun to, kind of watch students to see if they were taking any of these particular actions. The one I've always found the funniest, and hopefully didn't laugh when students did it, but the expression of repression of creature releases. It was weird. I would have students, and more students than I thought really was normal, would get nosebleeds during tests, and I really didn't appreciate being shown blood, in that particular respect. But this was their expression of repression of creature releases, that they just had to leave because their nose was bleeding in that way. So. All right, actions avoided, again, these are things that were part of that students worked into their performance, that we're trying to manage the impression and avoid the stigma of being a cheater here during taking a test. So actions avoided: control of eyes, So students know they're not supposed to have roving eyes and looking at other people's papers. So they would stare just at the head, the back of the head of the person in front of them. Control of notes. Students would frisk themselves before entering to ensure that they weren't carrying anything that might get them in trouble. And morality of place. Students, in the interviews that they had with the researchers, said that they worried that where they sat could send a message about whether or not they were going to cheat or not. So students said that they would be careful not to sit next to a very good student, for fear that they would cheat off of the good student, or they would not sit next to someone who was perceived to be a potential cheater and therefore get kind of wrapped up into that as well. And so these were all attempts to try and manage the impression and make sure that they were presenting themselves, as the definition says here, as ways that are most favorable to their own interests and their own role as a student here. But sometimes impression management fails, despite our efforts and that sort of thing. And so when impression management fails and we mess up and we goof up, a person will then engage in what's called face-saving behavior. A definition here. Okay. So they'll engage in face-saving behavior. Which are using, taking action, strategies we use to rescue our performance when we experience a potential or actual loss of face. So simplest example is, you're walking down the hallway somewhere and you trip, or you trip and fall. And so that's just the most basic sort of mess up in terms of, you're just clumsy and uncoordinated, and that's probably not the impression you want to leave with others, regardless of the setting and what role you're performing. And so you'll do certain things to try and recover and rescue your performance there. In terms of tripping and falling, you might use humor and laugh it off, or try and make a funny joke to deflect people's attention. You might get angry and just try also just to try and shift the focus. You might get incredibly embarrassed and then try to run away. But yeah, so we do certain things to try and rescue the performance and save face there. Now, the researchers I just talked to you about, Albus and Albus, they also studied this aspect in their study of college university students as well. So one of their studies, for example, asked, what happens when a student doesn't get the grade that they thought they would in a class or no, on a test, I think is what they looked at. So, getting a grade that they didn't expect, could potentially lead to a loss of face because, they're not the good student, that they were trying to be, or they're not the student that maybe just wanted to pass, but say they failed. So what Albus and Albus did was they explored the strategies that university students use to create desired appearances to save face, impression manage, after receiving their grades on a test or an assignment. So they divided, the typical things that students did into 3 categories. So they looked at the group of students who they divide encounters into 3 categories. So they were looking at the interactions between different groups of students, different types of students. So they looked at, the two students who both aced the test. So ace encounters. And then they would look at encounters where the student that aced the test, and they were interacting with someone who bombed the test or failed it. And then they looked at those encounters where it was bomber versus bomber, in the interaction. And so they were looking at kind of what they told each other and how they interacted. So for number one, let's make sure I get this right here, and I'll mark this up so I don't lose my own place here. So for ACE-ACE encounters, these encounters, Albus and Albus said, occur in a rather open atmosphere because there's a lot of comfort and even pride in sharing a very high mark with another high achiever. So it was very acceptable within these situations to violate norms like modesty, and so they found students bragging a lot in these in the ACE-ACE encounters. And arguably in the ACE-ACE encounters, there really wasn't a need to manage one's impression or save face because they both ace the test. For the ACE bomber encounters, Albus and Albus said these encounters were very sensitive. They were often sensitive. The bomber in the interaction attempted to avoid such encounters and exchanges because they knew they would look bad, particularly in the face of someone who aced a test. So when they were forced to interact, though, the bomber would work to appear gracious and congratulatory toward the student that aced the test. The ACEs, in return, would offer sympathy and support for the bomber and even rationalize their own lucky high mark. And that's how they, oh, I just got lucky. So they're trying to diminish a bit of, their accomplishments to try and allow the bomber to save a bit of face and not feel as bad in this interaction. So to help the bomber save face, ACEs may emphasize, say, the difficulty of the test, or maybe say, oh yeah, that test was very unfair. It was really too hard. And so that was helping out the bomber to try and save face. Now, with the bomber-bomber interactions, these often took place in closed encounters, and no one else was sort of kind of privy and allowed to sort of see these encounters. And this was intentional because when you had more than one student who bombed the test, they would collectively try and put up a wall to isolate them from any disdain or any bad thoughts from other and bad words from other people about how badly they did on the test. So when they were in the safety of other bombers, the bomber would openly share their disappointment and engage, and they would together engage in mutual self-pity, or have a pity party, for example. And they would devise face-saving excuses for their poor performances. So they might try and save face by blaming the teacher. They might call them, just an incompetent, teacher. They're mean and they made the test too hard for everybody. So that was a way to shift the blame, shift the focus, and help them try and save a little bit of face and come out of the encounter a bit better. So as this one example is meant to demonstrate, when impression management fails, a person may engage in face-saving behavior. As Goffman defined it, strategies we use to rescue our performance when we experience a potential or an actual loss of face. And researchers have shown, and I already went through this as well. So researchers have shown that typically people use 3 different, options. There's others, but these are kind of some of the more common ones. Using humor, you impress upon others that you have your act together because you can laugh at yourself. Face-saving behavior involving anger. This is an attempt to say to the audience, I'm powerful, even though I tripped and fell up these stairs. Retreat as a face-saving behavior. That's kind of obvious. Our act has failed, and so we just want to leave the stage as soon as possible. Okay, so the point with ethnomethodology and specifically the dramaturgical analysis within it, this helps us realize that there are patterns of interaction that we're guided by, even though we're not thinking about these patterns or these rules and all of these elements here. And so these patterns of interaction become so ingrained in us that they become unconscious, but they nevertheless conform to larger patterns of behavior and rules for interaction with others. So I'm going to come back to our opening case as well. And with this week, with week 7, you had just kind of part 2 of the Ralph Klein Goes to a Homeless Shelter One Night story. And the part 2 is an interview in the news with one of the men at that shelter that night, 10 years later. And you have a really interesting kind of look at this one individual and the impact that one night, that fleeting encounter, that fleeting interaction he had with, a powerful individual, Ralph Klein, in that case. And here we kind of actually have both of them kind of an example of saving face and impression management in this example. In the case of, and I didn't include this in well, it is in here just a little bit here. So if we look at the Premier Ralph Klein, and as the article and the note that you read said, in the days following the incident, after all the bad publicity, he did apologize, and then he did admit that he had a drinking problem, and that was probably why he did what he did this one night. He was out at an event where he was likely drinking. And so this is an attempt to save face, in this particular case. He knew he did something horribly wrong by going in and abusing and yelling at and demeaning a group of men who just happened not to have homes at that particular moment. One of them in particular, as we've said, is this Mark Shea, who's pictured here on the left. Mark Shea at that particular time kind of defied the stereotypical, status of a homeless person, in that he actually did have a job. He just hadn't made enough money yet to be able to afford rent for various circumstances there. So Ralph Klein did a horrible thing, but he attempted to save face and try and kind of minimize his responsibility in a way by trying to claim that he had a drinking problem. Now that said, that kind of then potentially also is a negative status, but we'll just leave that for now. On the other hand, and this is why I like that the 10-year later kind of story here, looking at what happened to Mark Shea in the years after that. And that's a really, we could see that as, also a face-saving, attempt to try and, tell the story of how an individual who was down on their luck and was just having a hard time temporarily is able to, through hard work, and no doubt it was maybe even harder for him because at the time he was homeless, and it probably took him a long time to overcome that, but he did. He had a good job, he went to school, he has a family, and so a really interesting sort of look at how even a fleeting interaction goes to the kind of goes to impact people in really profound ways in the moment and long term as well. All right, so our last slide here is again our journal post question. Again, the same question number 1 is going back to that current issue or event and pulling some information from the social interaction topic. And so given this video here, one potential thing you can do if the issue or event allows it, can you do a brief dramaturgical analysis of that event or that issue? And, what's the front stage, the backstage, how were props used, what was the script, was the person, doing good at their performance, or was there a need to do impression management and that sort of thing. The second question is, this actually comes directly from the online textbook here, and there is a box, and I'm forgetting which page it is. It doesn't really matter. But there they ask you to do a conversational analysis, and I picked two of the questions that they asked there, and yeah, just following this and using some of the information from the video or the lecture videos, do a bit of a symbolic interactionist analysis of your conversation. So in analyzing a recent conversation, what were the symbols, the meanings, what role did statuses and roles play in that conversation, and how did you maybe determine kind of the reality, the truth, the meaning of that conversation together with that person you were having a conversation with.